Okay, hello and welcome to today's seminar hosted by International Inequalities Institute at LSE. My name is George Kunath. I'm an associate professor and lifelong engagement lead for the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity program. I'm incredibly pleased to be chairing today's seminar titled Multiple Oppressions and Resistances in Spaces of Inequality, a study from the indigenous landscapes of Eastern India, which is part of the III Inequality Seminar Series. Today's speaker is Dr. Richard Toppo. Richard is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. He completed his PhD at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. His research looks at the indigenous social movements in eastern state of Jharkhand in India. As usual, there will be a chance to pose questions following his presentation. We will take questions from both in-person and online audience. Now, I will now hand over to Richard. Many thanks, and I hope all of you enjoy the event. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you. Well, thank you, George, and thanks to all of you for coming here. I'm extremely delighted to be sharing this space with all of you, and perhaps we can have some interesting conversations once I'm done with the presentation. Hope you enjoy the presentation. So on this particular topic, which is on multiple oppression and multiple resistances in spaces of inequality, I mean, what's new in this? Because when talking about inequality, we do talk about oppressions because this is where one of the most default factors comes into play. And when we do have oppressions, we might as well have instances of resistances happening in these spaces. So what we are going to look into as to how in this particular indigenous landscape of India, how do we come across or how do we understand these different forms? And is it linking or hinting at something else that either conforms to whatever we know from a theoretical perspective, or does it add something new to the existing theories that we have? For the sake of clarity, let me start by saying that I'm going to interchangeably use the word indigenous and Adivasis. Now we can get into the politics of it at maybe during the Q&A session, but as of now, Adivasis, I'm referring, whenever I use the word Adivasi, it is in reference to indigenous communities in India. The structure of the presentation will be as follows. In the first part, maybe for around 10 minutes or so, I'll be talking about the context, about the case that, I hate to use the word case, but I'll be talking about the case that I have been looking into and looking at the specific instances of oppression and resistance that has taken place. In the second part, we are trying to analyze as to, okay, how do we understand these oppressions that has happened in these spaces? And in the last part, we are going to look into understanding the different forms of resistance that people have come up with. And lastly, and I think that's from a methodological point of view, it's really important as to look into the question of so what that we have this study, so what that I went into these spaces, what does it mean for the people actually there? Moving on. From a theoretical point of view, it's very important, I think, to look into the questions of how and why of resistance and oppression. As to whether, again, as I said earlier, it's conforming or whether it's extending the current understanding of some of these ideas. So to come to the context now, my research during my PhD was primarily based in the eastern Indian state of Jharkhand. To give a very brief idea of Jharkhand, Jharkhand is one of the hotbeds of Maoist insurgency, of armed insurgency. Jharkhand also happens to be one of the places where indigenous politics, the Adivasi politics, is really active. It has close to 26% of indigenous population. But more importantly, something that I would like to point out is this particular area that are marked in the green part. My focus was on this particular area. This is the administrative block of Mahmuda, which is in the Latehar district of Jharkhand. And much of the population in this area, which is again close to 78%, it comes under the category of indigenous. 78% of the people come from indigenous And much of the villages that I was looking at, most of them actually were 99 or 100% populated by indigenous communities. Now, there's a reason why I'm saying this, which we'll come to later. Now, what was happening in this area, for that, we need to travel back to 1950s and 1960s. Now, of course, in the 1940s, we got our independence. And 1950s, we had a couple of policies coming up, policies that were very specific and relevant to this particular field. We had a couple of policies which are very specific to how armies practiced firing, how armies could reserve a particular area without any opposition, without any consent that was required, and they could step into certain spaces and just practice firing. So what happened? One fine day in the 1960s, and this is something that villagers themselves told me, some of them fortunately are still alive, they told me that one fine day, they suddenly saw some administrative officials who they could recognize were not from the locality, and they had the look of a bureaucrat. So they saw some of these people going around surveying the land and taking some notes. And when they came up and asked these people, oh, what are you guys doing? They didn't really have any answer to give. They're like, oh, we are just doing our work, this, that. What happens is a couple of months later, they suddenly have a notification coming from the army that their lands are going to be used for firing practice. And this was completely based on no information that they received or any forms of consent that they were asked for. Many a time, legally, they were required to inform these people at least 2 months before. The entire setup was such that the army would come into these 7 villages at that particular point of time. They had earmarked 7 villages to carry out the firing practice. So the army would come to these 7 villages. Legally, they were required to inform 2 months before that we are going to come to these areas, and the people should vacate these areas temporarily, not permanently, temporarily for a couple of days, with no help from the government. They were supposed to, on their own, completely go to whatever place they want to. They can go into the forest. They have to maintain a radius of, I think, 3 to 5 kilometers, but they can go into the forest, they can go into any of the relatives' place. Officially, the government could have provided them compensation, but from the stories that we have heard, the compensation was too little and was not even provided. Now, what happened once the army came into going about the firing practice is that the people had to leave the place, the people had to leave their villages temporarily for a couple of days, and then they would return back to find much of their villages destroyed by the armies. I mean, imagine this, that at least in the 1960s, it was much more about lighter ammunition, lighter firepower that they would do. So think about Enfield rifles, think about, say, semi-automatic rifles or other things. But then we are proceeding, if 10 or 15 years later, if we are proceeding 20 or 30 years later, the army is also coming with heavy machineries. And when I'm talking about heavy machineries, we're also talking about tanks, we're also talking about mortars, we're talking about rocket launches. So it's not just about firing practice against a particular set of targets, but also firing practice open in the fields. So here is something that needs to be noted. Now, what happens to the people who were staying in these areas? One, the agricultural fields are completely destroyed. Now think about a farmer, an indigenous farmer who is farming for a good 6 months to cultivate his land. That's his entire livelihood. He has to sell the produce to make a living for himself or herself. And then the army comes into the place, conducts firing practice. It doesn't require any permission from anyone. The fields are destroyed. The person doesn't know what else to do. What about livestock that they have, the cows, the buffaloes, the goats that they have, and their livelihood is very much dependent on these livestock as well. Many a times they were able to carry along their livestock, but many a times they were not able to carry their livestock along. Because if the information came sometime in the morning, say at 6 o'clock, suddenly there's a drum beat saying that, oh, you have to vacate the village. They didn't really have enough time. Think about people having 20 or 30 bullocks, like where they're going to find or push everyone out of the village and take them along. So there were many instances where livestock were killed. There were also instances of violent assaults that was done by army officials because they were just exercising their power. They felt that they were powerful enough to do grave assaults, sexual assaults on people in these areas. One of the other things that needs to be noted is in many of these areas where fighting practice was conducted, when the shells were fired from tanks, many times these shells didn't explode and they remained as live ammunition in the fields. And when people actually went to collect these live ammunitions, this would explode. So many of the people lost their legs, many of the people lost their limbs and other things. And it was sort of a grievous situation for many of the people who were in these areas. What happened in the 90s was, now this event, this entire firing practice was continuing from 60s to 90s. And that was the legal permission that was given as per law, that they had the permission until 90s. So the government now in the 90s, and this is both the state government and the central government very much acting in tandem. So in the 90s, what happened was the state actually says that, well, we want to continue the firing practice, but we just don't want to, we also want to have a permanent base in these areas. We don't want to come here temporarily. We don't want to, take all the trouble of coming here for a couple of days and then again going back. We actually want to set up a permanent firing range in these areas. And then the government came up with a proposal that, okay, we are going to take this entire area from the 7 villages that earlier they used to conduct firing practice in. They said that we are going to take away 245 villages, which would affect some good 150,000 people, most of them indigenous. There was no talk of rehabilitation, or there was no talk about what would happen, to these population. So the notification was issued, the government passed the order, and the permission that was legally granted was between 92 to 2002. And again, in the year 2002, they again extended it to 2022. At this point of time, when the people got to know that the government is actually planning to permanently displace them from these areas, it really came together in numbers of hundreds of thousands. Like, they really gathered together. They really sort of had this determination that we need to fight against these oppressive policies of the state. And this is where they came together to form an organization, which one can say it was a very organic organization of the people by themselves, which is called as Kendriya Jan Sangharsh Samiti in these areas. And spearheaded by this organization, they very much protested against the army trucks trying to enter these areas. As you can see in the picture, this picture was taken by Toppo. He's quite a renowned activist and a documentary maker. So at that time, he took these pictures where you can see that the army jeeps are very much confronted by people who actually said that one of the popular slogans in this movement was "Jaan denge, zameen nahi denge," which literally translates to, we are ready to give our lives, but we are not ready to give our lands. This movement, so the people, once they confronted in the 92-93, they were actually able to stop the army from coming into these areas. The army actually had to retreat from these regions, and that was seen as a victory of the people. But it was a very practical, a very strategic victory. The rules were still in place. So if the army wanted, which it did try in the year 2002, it did try to, it was 2002 or 2004, I'm a bit confused about the date, but the army did try to come into these places again. So for the movement people, for the population in these areas, it was important to continue this struggle. It was important to continue this mobilization. So for the last 30 years, they have been holding different protest movements, different demonstrations. Specifically, they have chosen the date 22nd and 23rd of March every year. That was the day when they actually stopped the army, and they celebrate that day as a commemoration event to remember the sacrifices that they have made, to remember the resolve that they had, that they are not going to give away their lands regardless of whatever the cost is going to be. And it continues till date, actually. These are some of the pictures from the recent times. Now, of course, when we're talking about a particular struggle, it's not confined with only one objective. When we're talking about a movement, we are not just talking about that there's a clear objective, and over the years, it's only going to follow these very precise objectives. of course, the moment people are also seeing and observing different things that are happening to indigenous communities in the very surroundings, and they started taking up other issues as well. So on the picture on the right, there was a protest against the Citizenship Amendment Act that the government wanted to implement, the central government wanted to implement. This is from the election scene where the moment people really wanted to get intimately involved in terms of having their voices heard. So based on these entire struggles, based on this entire movement, finally in August 2022, the government of Jharkhand finally said that, and again, I'm very carefully using the word said. So it finally said through official channels that it is going to revoke the notification that was issued, that it is going to cancel the plan. Now, why I'm emphasizing on the term issued, said, because the government actually never issued a public order through gazetteer, like it only said. So, of course, one can look into the statements of the government that was made in the past, coming out from the secretariat itself, but there's no proper legal document as a gazetteer where notifications are published, which actually says that it's that the notification has been revoked, and which somewhat got this entire movement into a bit of a confusion that has the notification been nullified? Do we actually now peacefully go back to our places and comfortably think that the future is going to be better and they don't really have to be concerned about themselves getting the space? So this is the entire story about it. This is the case that I was dealing with during my PhD, at least a part of it. Now, the question comes into the why part of oppression, as to why did it happen? Why was it the case that these communities, this space, these many people, they faced oppression? Some of the questions that I really think make sense is, why choose this particular site for employers? They could have gone to India as a big country. They could have gone to any other place. Even Jharkhand is a bigger country, it's a bigger state. So they could have gone to any other space for that matter. So why choose this particular site? The other questions would be, how does inequality or unequal spaces play their part in configuring this entire dynamics? And more importantly, as to how the state goes about in enforcing its oppression. How does it go about in actually imposing the oppressive measures towards the people? Now, this is where it's important to understand inequality. This is important to see as to how indigenous communities, the Adivasis, were placed in this very region. Many of the villages that were going to be displaced were coming from this particular region. So one of the important things perhaps I should tell you about is the historical dimensions to how this decision came about. And this has been quoted also in a PUDR document. I think PUDR stands for
People's Union for Democratic Rights.
People's Union for Democratic Rights. So in a 1994 document, which it did with on the neighborhood movement on this particular firing range, it came out with a particular story, and which was also sort of confirmed by other activists who were very much active during those times in the 90s, was that army actually initially planned to have it in a different space, in this other place by the name Gaya, which is also in the same state, the then Bihar. But what happened was, in Gaya, there were dominant people whose lands would have been occupied. They were not so poor, relatively richer. They had quite a political clout in terms of who the political parties were in power. And despite the initial plan of having the firing range over there, which would have permanently displaced the other people, they decided to move it here. Now, the story goes that there was enough cloud, or there was enough strings pulled to make sure that no such plan comes in a place where there are dominant communities living. And I think that is a story that is I mean, we can find examples across the world that it's never the dominant communities that will suffer from displacement or any such other things. So here we have army pulling back from an area which was actually habited by the dominant communities, who were very resourceful. And then it shifted to this particular area in the hopes or with the idea that there won't be enough resistance. The name of this firing project was actually pilot firing range project. The pilot comes from the idea that let's look into places where we can actually get into, or let's look into places where we can set up this firing range with as little amount of resistance, with as little amount of rebellion, revolt coming from the people. So they found it perfect that, wow, like we have an area where we have indigenous communities. They are not going to rebel. They are not going to resist or revolt. Let's put it up in these places. Now, the reason why I'm saying this in this particular way, we'll come to it later in the next slide. But let's understand inequality in terms of economic resources, in terms of social capital, and somewhat related to social capital, the political connections. Here, more than 70% of the population in these areas, which anyway come from indigenous countries, they are very much dependent on agriculture. As per the latest data, sadly, it's only of 2011 that we have the SECC data that we have, the socioeconomic class survey. It says that in this particular area, the highest earning member in a family, on average, is the highest earning is somewhere close to 5,000 rupees. That's close to say 50 pounds per month, and this constitutes somewhere close to 80% of the population. Now, I want to spend some time in this particular slide. When we are talking about how indigenous communities were displaced, how they were chosen over other people for the purpose of displacement, how the Norman thought that, oh, these are the people whom we can actually displace without having to face much of resistance, it's important to go a level deeper into understanding why these people. Why is it that it's only the indigenous landscape? It's only the oppressed people. It's only people coming from certain communities that always have to face these things. Now, of course, there are certain theories that might try to answer why these spaces are unequal in related terms. Why is it that indigenous communities or indigenous populated areas are not considered to be, say, dominant enough, are not equal enough? Now, some might say that, well, it's only a matter of time when such spaces will catch up. It might just be the case that two different spaces are on a different economic trajectory, and it's only a matter of time that one region will catch up with the other. However, in the last 50 or 100 years, we have seen that these inequalities are getting reproduced, and in fact, the inequality is very much increasing, even if you look at the micro or the macro data at the country level. Some people, cultural theorists might say that, well, indigenous communities are a very isolated lot. They are very reserved from the communities. They are very much insulated. They very much tend to stay in particular regions. And this has much more to do with how their cultural behavior is. This has much more to do with how their way of engaging with the mainstream is, which explains this difference, this inequality in terms of where they are placed economically or socially. But again, when we are talking about this difference, we also have to remember that in the last 100 years or so, the capital has been forcing their way into these areas, and it's not just forcing their way into indigenous landscapes. It's about adversely integrating them into their circuits. It's not just about leaving them as they are. I mean, I don't know, on a hypothetical note, I might say that they might be better, but as of now, the tragedy is that the circuits of capital have very adversely integrated them within their structures. Few others might say that maybe it's a core periphery debate that we can refer to, that we can draw from.
What do you mean by adversely integrating?
By adversely integrating, I would refer to how they are at the receiving end of the entire process. So say when we are talking about them participating in market-based transactions, they are at the receiving end of being exploited by, say, intermediaries or people who are buying labor or goods from them. Yeah. So, and Archana Prasad and others, they have quite some good work on the adverse integration of Adivasis in India. Then we can also draw from corporate free, saying that these are the sites of extraction, and I think that actually explains a lot. But at the same time, we also have to remember that here in these villages, we do have Adivasis owning the piece of land. So we need to also understand as to how these things are taking shape in terms of how, as you were saying, what do you mean by adverse integration? We have to get deeper into how are they adversely integrated, how exactly or why exactly is this process taking place. Also, they can be factors of environmental determinism. One might as well say that because these spaces are very much forested, these spaces are very much hilly terrains, these spaces are not really connected to the markets, and which is why we really have these sort of things coming up, the inequality coming into picture. But then again, the question is going to be asked, that should be asked is, why is it that only a particular community inhabits these spaces, and why is it that only a particular community has to face a very patterned way of discrimination, inequality, suppression / oppression? Now, for me, the point that I'm trying to make is we need to look at a more holistic picture. We need to really look into how history plays its role, how discrimination plays its role, how social structures play their role in terms of really marginalizing the indigenous population in these areas. So when we're talking about inequality, when we're talking about why the Adivasis, the indigenous people in the region where they were, where we had the army people coming to practice their firing, why was it only that place? We really have to connect it to why they thought that these are the people that could not resist. And when we are thinking about why these people are not the ones that would resist, we have to connect it to how their trajectory has been in terms of understanding their socioeconomic positioning, in terms of understanding their cultural positioning in the larger scheme of things. So then comes into the question of, we come into the question of how did inequality play its part in enforcing? So here, in the previous slide, as we were talking about, different forms, the reasons why inequality was taking ground, looking at things from a socio-historical perspective, it's important to connect that part of the story as to how these oppressions were being practiced. And here the dots really connect when we look into why the indigenous people were not considered good enough to be taken consent from. Why is it that the bureaucrat whom I told you guys about in the 1960s, when he was surveying and when an indigenous person approaches him and says that, oh, there's nothing. There's a reason why he thinks, or any other bureaucrat thinks that, oh, I don't have to explain my reasons to this particular person, because there is a certain socio-historical trajectory to this particular person. So we do have indigenous communities who were not at all shared the information about what is going to happen on their own lands. They were never given any information as to whether they're going to be displaced or whether they really have to move to other areas. Some of the very current or very practical things that the state did was file in heavy police charges on many of these indigenous activists, such as to keep them busy with many of the police cases. Still, many of the people are suffering from this. Having looked into the forms of oppression, it's important to look into the many forms of resistance. Some of the questions that are, I think, very relevant to this particular context is, okay, why do people resist? Now we can think through a host of theoretical lens. We can think about creed, we can think about grievances, we can think about moral economy as to whether it was more about them sustaining through this entire time, whether it's actually about framing of certain struggles, where someone actually framed things in a particular way, as Snow would say it. to give them the idea that they need to protest, they need to fight against the oppressive structures, or was it just a culture of revolts? What I saw and what I did in my PhD was to take a sort of Foucauldian framework of subject production, of how indigenous subjects were produced, of how they were constructed, of how they were created, of how their subjectivities were formed. So it was not just a particular instance, it was not just the discourses, it was very much the practices that were happening around them. So here we are talking about oppressions that are taking place on indigenous communities, and people having this idea that, oh, indigenous communities are being oppressed. This is how the oppression is taking place. And at the same time, there is a talk about, amongst the activists, there is a talk about how indigenous communities have to come together to actually collectively resist against the structures. So this entire discourse and the practices is somewhat building sort of a subjectivity. It's creating the indigenous subject in terms of how they see themselves as part of the larger structure. But there was a very interesting letter that was written in 1970s by these very villagers who were troubled by the army. And in the letter, they wrote to the then communications minister, I believe, in which they actually specified that we, the indigenous people who have historically been oppressed and who have historically been marginalized, we need to be heard. And this is something that is done based on our identity. So this idea of identity, as people say, proponents of framing would say, it was more of a strategic tool. But I believe that it was more of a subject creation. It was much more about them actually believing that this is what is happening. It was more about the subjectivity formulation. And the reason to look into it in that particular way is how they went about it, is how they blurred the lines between different classes, different religions, between different entities. They really went beyond the binaries of, say, if we are looking into social movement theories, somewhere we do see binaries of oppression and the oppressed, and rightly so. In subaltern studies, when we look into the binaries, we always see the elites and the subaltern. Here, what I found was people really use the identity aspect to enter or to navigate the fields of how to bring different people together. So we have indigenous community person, one who is a rich businessman for that matter, and someone who is really on the streets, them coming together on the same platform and protesting for issues of indigeneity. And for me, the reason why that is happening is because the rich person, the rich indigenous person as well, his subjectivities were constantly being reshaped on the ideas of indigeneity. His subjectivity, his or her, sorry, their subjectivities was constantly being reproduced on the existing ideas of indigenous activism, on the existing ideas of how they see indigenous discourses playing around. So they somewhere in going about this movement, they somewhat blurred the boundaries. They somewhat went across these entity boundedness that we had of involving different people to come together as a collective and protest against the oppressive structures. And it was in this particular subjectivity formation, which again was highly influenced by certain actors, which inspired them that violence was not the way. And that might be right or wrong. I'm no one to judge that, but it was in a particular formulation of these subjectivities that non-violence was very much preached to the people, and that's how they saw their own subjectivity very much aligned with these ideas. That they actually, in fact, they actually had an argument with armed rebellions, saying that no, this is what we want to do, and they had good justification for it. They also, in this very line of thinking, they participated in the elections and they were able to get different actors, not just people who are protesting on the streets, not just rich businessmen for that matter, but also very much politicians who were seated in decision-making tables to somewhat influence them, to somewhat motivate them, or to somewhat get them into their sphere of influence so that they can take decisions in the favor of indigenous communities. Now, in this entire process of understanding resistance, in this entire process of dealing with resistance, the people somewhere they designed or they somehow tried to challenge inequality that they saw they were deeply embedded in. So when we are talking about the socio-historical evolution of Adivasi positionality, of indigenous positionality, which is at a very hierarchical level, we are talking about indigenous activists, indigenous people who want to very consciously challenge this hierarchical positioning. Now, one of the ways in which they challenged it was by claiming the identity, this very same identity that was used to discriminate them. That is owning the identity. And which is where, also going back to my previous slide, how subjectivities were formed, of how subjects, indigenous subjects were created. So here we do have people who are very much thinking about that, oh, we are the Adivasis, we are the indigenous people, and this is what we stand for. We are somewhat connected to the land. It's our duty and not just right to have access and to protect our lands, forests, water resources. So here in the construction of this identity, they really started asserting their identity against any of the marginalization that was happening before. Now, one of the examples that I can thank you. One of the examples that I can quickly give is a few years back, and this is say somewhere close to 10 or 15 years back, say 20 years back, we had discrimination to the extent of people being targeted at the very streets in this particular area that I showed you guys. Where this is a discussion that I was having with George as to how buses have become this very common sites of discrimination. That how if an indigenous person is seated in a bus, somehow the bus driver and the bus conductor doesn't think that it's appropriate for an indigenous person to sit in the bus. They'll ask them to, oh, why are you sitting? Like stand up and make way for someone else in non-indigenous person who enters into the bus and have him sit in the seat. And this is one of the most benign forms of things. There are much more brutal things that has happened in these areas. Now, there's a very visible aspect of how discrimination is taking place because of a particular identity. Now, in Adivasis claiming this identity, they were fighting back against this so-called visible aspect of discrimination. They were fighting back saying that this is our identity, we are going to own it, and we don't want, or we refuse to be bogged down, or we refuse to be discriminated on the basis of our belief, our culture. So in this aspect, they also organize several identity-based cultural events. The people got together to block many of the caste groups, the oppressive groups, especially targeting shops of many of these oppressive people, somewhat boycotting them. It was also about the ways in which they participated in the elections. So in the previous slide, I was talking guys about, telling you guys about elections, about how people thought that it's important to participate in elections and bringing politicians in their sphere of influence. But earlier, what would happen, almost 10 years earlier, what would happen was politicians would generally come into these places, make promises, get out of the place, have votes, and that's it. End of the story as to how politicians behaved in these areas. What changed in this particular time was indigenous communities were not just participating, but they were also managing elections. And they very much fought for that because they believed that this is our space, this is our identity. We have to do things to protect it. And we need to get into spaces which can serve to protect the identity. So the question comes, this is the last slide. The question comes down to, so what? I mean, they might indeed be a theoretical contribution in terms of how we look into social movements. They might be theoretical contributions as to what learnings can we have in the ways in which people participated. Methodological contributions as well, based on indigenous standpoint and engaged observation. To what extent do we engage with communities and what kind of positionalities do we carry? But the important point for me was, so what? Like, what happens when, I mean, we do engage, we do have these theories coming up in ivory towers, but what's beyond this? And this is where I think one of the most important learnings was how do we engage with the community as scholar activists? And so there's something that June Boris, the editor of Journal of Peasant Studies, in his valedictory speech, he mentioned that whenever we are talking about scholar activism, we often tend to relate to our commitments to academic and activism activities. We often tend to think about in terms of, oh, how do we make our commitments towards scholarly works. And often it has been found that we are much more committed towards, and it's easier to commit towards academic works by all the checks and balances that we have in place, but there's no measure as to how do we validate our commitment, or how do we explore or examine our commitments towards activism, towards the communities. And this is something that really has to come out from the people themselves. It's the people themselves who really have to see through a researcher's work. And this can, I believe, only happen through a long-term engagement. As Tolbe from Canada, she speaks about how many times we engage in a give and take relationship and somehow morally justify ourselves that, oh, we did provide something to the community, but then again, that's making the entire thing transactional. It's more about long-term engagement, and then together with the community, collectively dismantling the institutions of oppression. So this was about the multiple forms of oppression and resistance, and how, as researchers ourselves, we are also part of this entire process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your insightful presentation. I will now open the floor for questions from the audience. We have many online attendees today, and online attendees can use the raise hand function to pose your questions, or paste your questions on the chat, stating your name and affiliation where possible. We'll first take the question from the room. Yes, we have big hands, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. Jacob, with the LSE. I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on the process that led to what you found, basically, what the process that led to the oppression that then came up in your conversations with the villagers. Because I thought in the beginning you were hinting at that the government could have chosen any side anywhere in India to do this, but there was a state government that said but didn't issue that they wouldn't do this anymore. And also noticed on the map it seemed to be just at the border of Jharkhand and what is now Chhattisgarh. And back then I assume would have been Madhya Pradesh. So it also looked like maybe there was something with the state. I was just wondering politically, who made that decision at that time? Does now Jharkhand have to find a different side for this, or is it the federal forces that can go anywhere in India to do these kind of things? Yeah, just to understand basically who at that point was making those decisions not to engage with the people that you spoke with or their ancestors. Yeah, thank you.
We take other questions too. Federico?
Yeah, Federico, also affiliated with LSE. I want to ask you, you said that being like indigenous became like something across all classes, and that the rich person and the poor person work together. Now that the threat from the Indian army is not so pressing, has this category continued being so strong, or has it started to be like deteriorating?
There was one hand. Yes, Anusha.
Also affiliated with the LSE. My question was, do you think these adverse feelings towards Adivasis, is this like a legacy of British rule in India, or is it something that happened post-independence?
You want to answer these three questions, and then the next round.
Okay, so regarding the question of who took this decision, whether it was the federal or the central or the state government who made this decision, the records are not clear. I mean, we don't really know as to how exactly this decision making came about, but something that people do know, the movements people and others, that it was a collective decision which was never opposed by the state government. So when we're talking about the constitution and the state list and the concurrent list and the union list, like there are certain subjects that are under exclusive domain of the state government, and then there are subjects that are under the exclusive domain of center, and then there are certain areas where both have powers. So in this particular case, land was essentially a state subject. Land is something that state has exclusive control over. In this particular case, if the state objective, there was no way that a central authority could have come into picture and they would have done whatever they did. So one might assume that center and the state were very much working together on this particular issue. Second, the army has different stations and bases in different parts of the country. So in India, the forces were stationed in the capital city, which is almost 200 kilometers away from this place, 150 to 200 kilometers away. So of course, they were looking within a radius or within the state-wide radius of where they could actually go to places. And I'm not really sure as to how the decision, the exact decision, the precise decision of this particular place came about. But from the likes of it, it seems that the state and the central government and the Indian Army were very much acting in tandem with each other. Now, I know that it's not the very correct response that you were looking forward to, but that's the information you have to. Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, it's very important to understand the class divisions as well. And when I say that, how class divisions or the class distinctions were being blurred by the social movements, I also realized that there was an effort to blur the lines. There were lines blurred, but it didn't mean that the categorization just fell apart. There were good, there's a good social, there's a good class division that exists within the Adivasis as well. And then to understand as to how this entire process came about, then to understand as to how people and their subjectivities evolved regardless of the classes, has more to do with what kind of threats they face. So now we have the instance of Netherhat firing movement, which was nullified, and there's sort of a confusion on as to whether this exercise will actually be continued in the later years or not. But there are several other issues like displacement, like denial of access to forest resources, like discrimination, like mob lynching for that matter. So there are enough grounds for people to bring them together as well. But then they are good enough structures in place that is pulling them apart as well on class dimensions. So we do see a very contradictory process taking place in this entire field. And as people who are associated with the movement, we think that it's more important to focus on blurring the lines as to trying to focus more on how we can go beyond these class, religion, and other divisions. So it's very much in evolution. There's no clear division or distinction, or there's no clear trajectory as to after the movement, this is how it goes. It's more of an evolutionary trajectory that is taking shape, and things are in contradiction. The contradiction is holding together in the same space. On the question of the role of the British, the British indeed have a very important role to play in the Indian history. But let's not forget that Adivasi subjugation hasn't really started from the colonial period. I mean, the subjugation was very much there and in practice in several of the areas. In certain parts, one might say that, it's the people were very much in excluded areas, people were very much in many of the forested areas, and how colonial powers brought them into mainstream administration, mainstream society. And there are examples contrary to that as well. But something that we need to very clearly remember is colonialism or British colony was not acting on its own. It had a support structure. It had a very good base of caste structure in place. So it very much acted together with the caste. It didn't act alternative or separately with the caste. It integrated itself with the caste structure to further oppress the people. So the two things have to be taken at the same time. They have to be seen as to how they interacted with each other and how in this interactive process they found the perfect oppressive subject. Like, so yeah, I hope that answers.
We'll take the next round of questions. Start with Chico and George and me. Any other questions? Okay, Michael.
So thanks very much, Richard. That was very nice. I'm gonna do something a little unusual, which is to try and, from your talk, make some very general statement. And the question is for you to comment on that statement. So, you know, you've walked into this room where we are involved every week on this difficult issue of trying to understand each other across disciplines. It's an interdisciplinary crowd. You have economists, anthropologists, everybody. And the languages are different. So as you were talking, I was thinking about words like oppression or like adverse integration, like Facundo asked about. And I was thinking that what it makes an economist like me think about is that there may be two very different levels of inequality. Most of us in economics, I'm going to try and be brief. Most of us in economics think of inequalities in market outcomes. So people come to with endowments, we call them, land, their own education, whatever. They trade in the market, and there's a distribution that results of that, and there is inequality in that distribution. But what you're talking about, and what others have talked about in the context of the Adivasi, but also in the context of indigenous people in Brazil, like the Yanomami, or the American Indians in the beginning, the indigenous people, Native Americans, and so on and so forth, and not only indigenous people, but also different groups within certain countries, is an inequality in rights prior to engaging in the market, conceptually prior to engaging in the market. And those rights, we can call them pre-market rights, we can call them rights to life and liberty. But let me humor me for a moment, I'm going to call them property rights, including in property rights, the rights of self-ownership. Okay. So what happens is in our little, I want my fellow economists to think of the Edgeworth box. Okay, so you've got an endowment in the Edgeworth box and you trade and you end up somewhere. And if the endowments are unequal, you're going to have an unequal outcome. But we don't even think that the endowments can be challenged. People come in with their endowments. But what's happening here is these communities had land, and through brute exercise of power, somebody takes away their land. Other communities have their own life, and that gets taken away from them, or their liberty, and they get imprisoned. I've also read about Adivasis in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh dealing with very deep inequalities in market power. They would collect these leaves, what are they called? PG? DD leaves, and then, you know, they can only sell them to one person who's a monopsonist, and, you know, takes all that away from them. They own this land. They are entitled by law to certain compensation if mining companies come in, but mining companies do some deal in Delhi, they come in and they don't. So it's as though, you know, in development, we need to think of two different, very different levels and layers of inequality. Inequalities in market outcomes, but also inequalities in the treatment of basic rights, and the respect for basic rights, which determine the effective endowments. So you and I may have the same endowments in the beginning, but because of the way the state treats us, you know, my endowments may be taken away or your endowments. And I think there's something interesting in that. So I wanted you to comment on it, whether it's all obvious or there's something there in the, you know, that could help the conversation.
You want to comment on Chico's?
Yeah, I mean, one, I agree with what you're saying. I don't think so there's any disagreement to that. One of the things that that as someone who is not an economist might want to look into is precisely what you said as to when people are participating in the market, what kind of histories that they are coming with, what kind of trajectories that they are heading into, who are the people that they're interacting with. And it's not as simple as saying that, and of course, you can very well elaborate, or you are very much aware of this. It's important to understand why do person A has a different trajectory, a different outcome when interacting with the market forces, and why B has a different outcome. And then it's important when we are trying to understand inequality, we need to not just look into this particular space of interaction, but also look into, okay, there's something wrong behind the scene. Let's get back to things that might not be so visible in the market system. And which is where I think the two disciplines or the different disciplines can come together to further explore as to how do we understand the entire process that is taking place.
Thanks, Richard. There is an online question from Ashish. Ashish, please raise your hand.
Yeah.
And then,
Hi, am I audible?
yeah,
Yeah, hi, Richard, good to see you again. I just have one question. So my question was that apart from all the land issues that you spoke about, and I joined a bit late, so I might have missed the earlier part. But I also wanted if you could shed some light on the issue of descheduling vis-a-vis the Sarna versus Christian debate that is taking place, which is also leading to an internal exclusion of land, which is being fueled by the state's intervention in the especially in the Orang community. So if you could shed some light on that, it will be really helpful, I think, for the audience as well. Thank you.
yes, please.
Okay, thanks, Ashish. Nice to hear from you. Yes, descheduling, I think that's a very important issue, and let me frame it in this particular way that, of course, we do see oppression taking place. We do see people who are from the dominant communities, the state, the very privileged economic and caste classes who tend to oppress, who tend to marginalize, who tend to sideline people from a particular community. And then, of course, we see different forms of resistance coming up from the people. But then we cannot just assume that it's this simple binary of oppression and resistance. Of course, the oppressor is going to come back. Of course, as we call it, empire strikes back. Sorry, that's bad. We do have these different right-wing forces who are again trying to perpetuate differences. Now the question is there a basis of such differences? And I believe there is a basis of such differences. It's not to say that the trajectory of Christian Adivasis and Sarna Adivasis, Sarna is in the animist, that's the closest relatable term that we have. The trajectories of Christian Adivasis and animist Adivasis have been the same. It's not to say that both of them have followed the same developmental trajectory. But the important part is when we are talking about descheduling, when we are talking about the divisions, it's very clear again, depending on which side of the spectrum you're situated in, to see as to how these divisions are being played out towards a particular goal, towards a particular political goal, how different divisions are somewhat further reproduced, further promoted, further highlighted to say that how the communities should be further fractured so that a collective mobilization cannot take place. Now, does it mean that I completely remain blind to the divisions? No, but does it mean that let me do something to not just bring the community together, but also do something about the class divisions? So for me, descheduling, of course, is in very clear terms, I don't think so that is the way to go forward, or that should be at all an option to be looking forward to. In case if you guys are wondering what descheduling is, in India, we have the scheduling of tribes. So the government refuses to acknowledge the term indigenous, but of course it needs to provide facilities or welfare measures to the people. So what it has done is it has created this category it has shortlisted this number of communities and put them under schedule. And all these tribes are referred to as scheduled tribes. Now, what the current ruling government is doing is it's saying that, well, they are the scheduled tribes, but within the scheduled tribes, there are a lot of people who have started following Christianity or who are Christians, and they're not actually tribals, so to speak, because they have lost their religion, they have lost their culture and so many other things, and their class status is different for whatever reasons. So actually, let's deschedule them. Let's bring them, put them outside the category of tribal. So this is the entire conversation about descheduling, and which is where my very clear answer or approach to this is descheduling cannot be the way forward in terms of if at all we are looking for working with the community. Does that answer you, Ashish?
Yes, yes, Victor, it does. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And we'll take the last question from Michael.
Oh, okay.
If you don't mind.
Apologies if this is an ignorant question, but I was interested that, so the state is probably the key decision maker here. And there's a 26% Indigenous population in the state. And so I guess what I would like to understand more is what are the barriers that prevent the movement from mobilizing that as an electoral block, because I might have predicted that it would have been easier over this time period, over such an egregious kind of display of power, to have that translated. So if you could say a bit more about the democratic interface.
I mean, that's, again, thank you for the question. I think it's very important to deal with this as to what is stopping people from coming together. And I think this is the age-old question as to the hegemonic influences of the dominant, the hegemonic influences of the class structures that we have, of the political structures that we have, that they have created so many divisions. And not just to say that they have created, the way in which the Adivasi society themselves have immersed. It is to say that it's difficult to see it in a very homogeneous way, to see it in a way, in a one single bonded entity sort of way. There are enough divisions on religious lines. The current national ruling party has been doing quite some efforts to again create fissures on this, on these divisions. There are good number of divisions on class lines, on gender lines as well. So there are enough divisions for BJP to exploit. And then there's aspect of narratives as well. There's aspect of storytelling, there's aspect of subjectivity formation, which I was earlier referring to. So let me give you a very brief example, if I may, in a minute.
Very brief.
So when people were protesting in that particular area against the firing practice, there was an entire mobilization of the people who came together and were fighting against the state. From the stories that we've heard, the then ruling party, the current national ruling party, and many of its proponents, they actually spread sort of a rumor amongst many of the say non-Christian or Sarna animist Adivasis, that this entire mobilization is very much a Christian plot, is their houses that are going to be attacked. And actually when the bullets are going to shower down, your houses won't be touched. So, it's as if that you are not going to be affected by the firing. You're not going to be affected by the tanks. The shells, when they drop, they'll identify that this is the house of Adivasi. They'll somehow navigate their way outside. This was the narrative, and many of the people actually believed it. So, and the problem is that the subjectivities are so strong, the narratives are so strong, then it becomes really hard to draw people out from that and then make them together, bring them together for a process of collective mobilization. Yeah, that's how it is.
Thank you. Thank you very much.